ताम्ररविन्देक्षणम् भक्ताभीष्टवराभयप्रदकरम् कौपीनमात्रोज्ज्वलम् स्वात्मानन्दरसानुभूतिविवशम् सर्वानवद्याङ्गकम् श्रीमन्तं श्रीरमणीश्वरं गुरुवरं योगासनाध्यासितं ध्यायेत् श्रीरमणीश्वरम् ध्यायेत् श्रीरमणीश्वरम् ध्यायेत् श्रीरमणीश्वरम् हृदयकुहरमध्ये केवलं ब्रह्ममात्रम् यहमहमिति साक्षादात्मरूपेण भाति हृदि विषमनसा स्वं चिन्वतामज्जतव पवनचलनरोधात् आत्मनिष्ठो भवत्वम्. Moramna. We will commence the Tuesday Atma Vicharam from Ramanacentre Center for Learning in Bangalore. By reading and meditating on Bhagavan's Upadesham, I'll be reading his Upadesham from the book Years in the Presence of Ramana, my Master, by Mahakrishna Swami. It is Sri Mahakrishna Swami's reminiscences of his presence with Bhagavan in Ramanashramam before he moved on to Brazil to start a Ramana Kendra there. And this is originally edited by our founder, President Sri A.R. Natarajanji. And we have been reading it, the second chapter of this book called Happiness, the Natural State of Being. After reading this week's question answer and meditating on it, we will have a 20 minutes practice session of self-enquiry. Following that, our President Sarada Akka would be talking about Ramana Gita, chapter 18, and finally we will have the concluding prayers to Bhagavan. The questioner asks Bhagavan how to obtain happiness. One second. How to obtain happiness? Bhagavan's answer is, happiness is not a state to be attained. The desire of happiness comes from the feeling of insatisfaction. And this pertains to the ego. To obtain happiness, it is not necessary to conquer something new, but only to free oneself from ignorance that makes one believe is in unhappiness. This part of the answer has been highlighted by Sri A.R. Natarajanji. I'll repeat it again. To obtain happiness, it is not necessary to conquer something new, but only to free oneself from ignorance that makes one believe in unhappiness. The victim of this ignorance is the ego. It is when one destroys the ego that perfect happiness appears naturally. Many people seek happiness in new adventures, discovering new regions, finding rare and curious objects. All this awakens great passion in them. But where can they find happiness? In themselves and in no other place. Is it not necessary to seek happiness beyond the self? All have the desire to be happy, protected from all suffering. They also seek to be free from all the diseases of the body and in their own way preserve a great love without which they believe happiness cannot be possible. In deep sleep, even though everything has disappeared, each one has the experience of happiness. However, due to the ignorance of their true nature, men prefer to act according to the erroneous belief that the path of happiness consists in obtaining earthly and celestial pleasures. The pleasure that ends in pain is still unhappiness, and the wise man prefers to avoid it. The different type of pleasure consists of the search of the objects of desire, still not satisfied, and the joy of possessing what is desired. I repeat Bhagavan's answer. Happiness is not a state to be attained. The desire of happiness comes from the feeling of insatisfaction. And this pertains to the ego. To obtain happiness, it is not necessary to conquer something new, but only to free oneself from ignorance that makes one believe in unhappiness. The victim of this ignorance is the ego. It is when one destroys the ego that perfect happiness appears naturally. Many people seek happiness in new adventures, discovering new regions, finding rare and curious objects. All this awakens great passion in them. But where can they find happiness? In themselves and in no other place. It is not necessary to seek happiness beyond the self. All have the desire to be happy, protected from all suffering. They also seek to be free from all the diseases of the body, and in their own way preserve a great love without which they believe happiness cannot be possible. In deep sleep, even though everything has disappeared and each one has the experience of happiness, however, ignorance of their true nature, men prefer to act according to the erroneous belief that the path of happiness consists in obtaining earthly and celestial pleasures. The pleasure that ends in pain is still unhappiness, and the wise man prefers to avoid it. The different type of pleasure consists of the search of the object of desire, still not satisfied. The different types of pleasure consists of the search of the object of desire still not satisfied, and the joy of possessing what is desired. So Bhagavan is saying here that if we are unhappy with what we are, what we possess right now, if there is a degree of dissatisfaction with whatever we have, then only we look for the happiness. And therefore, what do we have becomes the most important thing. And what do we have that we think is bringing dissatisfaction also becomes an important question to address. So if we possess worldly objects, and that is what we think we have, and we see that it is something apart, and therefore it is something that we are going to miss somewhere down the line. And therefore, even though we are satisfied that we are possessing that worldly object, we have the fear of losing it because it is separate, apart from me. And therefore, there will be this dissatisfaction that may come. So I may want to possess more of it, so that even if I lose a little bit of it, I still have enough of it. But that approach will never make us understand the natural satisfaction that is there. So Bhagavan is saying, therefore, happiness is not a state to be attained. So if we are dissatisfied and therefore we accumulate something so that we will be happy, Bhagavan is saying it cannot be something attained like that. So he goes on to say, the desire of happiness comes from the feeling of insatisfaction. And this pertains to the ego. So it is the ego, and Bhagavan very beautifully clarifies, the ego is an imaginary entity which binds the consciousness, the awareness, to an object. And therefore it is the Chit Jada Granthi, he says. So Chit being the awareness and the Jada being all the objects, inanimate objects, including the body, which is not possible, which doesn't have a consciousness of its own. So this ego, because it is aware, it is having the quality of the awareness, though borrowed, and it is always limiting itself to the objects. It thinks that possessing more objects will bring it happiness. And therefore this insatisfaction, the quality of insatisfaction with however much objects that it possesses, Bhagavan is saying it is with the ego, and due to this insatisfaction that it has, it goes on to believe that happiness can be attained by collecting more objects, more arts. So this whole approach, and Bhagavan very categorically makes it very clear, happiness is not a state that can be attained. And in Bhagavan, happiness is not something that you get at one point in time and then it fades away. It is something which has to be there. That is what we are all looking. So Bhagavan totally accepts that we are looking for some unalloyed happiness, happiness which doesn't come and go. But in all objective achievements by the ego, it gets a sense of happiness when it is achieved, but slowly and steadily it fades away. When that object or that desire has become little old or no more of greater importance, it loses that original charm or happiness that it had when it achieved it. Let us look at our own many examples. We wanted to do a degree, okay, then we did it, and when the marks came, we were very happy. But slowly, is that happiness carried on with us? No. Then it turned to using that marks to achieve something like a good job. So with that, when we got the first job, we were very happy. But is it something that stayed with us? No, slowly faded up into achieving more salary or more positions inside the organization. So it keeps on. That's why Bhagavan says it takes the consciousness and limits to the object, and that object keeps on changing from time to time. Therefore, the insatisfaction is the nature of the ego, and therefore, because its nature is insatisfaction, it keeps on looking for ways to attain happiness. So this is how our attention to the ego, to this I am this body idea, keeps us always rolling in this vicious circle of trying to attain more objects so as to attain happiness, and find that it is not enough, and then again go for something more or something different. So this is how it goes until we inquire who this ego is. And only then we find that it is non-existent. It's an imaginary thought. So Bhagavan goes on to say, to obtain happiness, it is not necessary to conquer something new. So Bhagavan is saying on one side that happiness cannot be attained, and on the other side, Bhagavan is saying if you want to obtain happiness, because the question is how to obtain happiness, Bhagavan is saying to obtain happiness, It is not necessary to conquer anything new. That means other than my own nature, anything that I hold on to will not bring happiness. So that's what Bhagavan is trying to say here. Other than my own nature, nothing else will bring happiness, because anything apart is something I feel that it is not me, and therefore I am trying to attain it new. And by that very virtue of trying to attain that something new, I will not get happiness, says Bhagavan. So we are losing happiness by holding on or trying to attain something. It may be knowledge, it may be object, it may be a great philosophical idea, it may be anything. As long as something apart is there that we are able to see, recognize, and want to attain, then the happiness is gone. Suppose I want to attain a spiritual knowledge, and I find somebody else comes and speaks so deep. I might have some degree of knowledge. Somebody talks a lot more than I can, and I feel that that person is lot more knowledgeable than me. Then the happiness goes away, because I find myself to be nowhere near him. That is how anything new will always make us to compare, make us feel either we are larger or smaller or somewhere to go. So see the differences. There will be some degree of differences that will automatically get created. So Bhagavan is very beautifully saying, if we need to obtain happiness, stop this attaining anything new. It may be in terms of knowledge, it may be in terms of doing something, it may be in something, gaining something. All this approach to new, we have to understand, will not bring happiness. Though this is a wonderful aid for us to recognize that natural truth. And Bhagavan brings, as we see in the next, somewhere down the line, he brings the sleep example. And he says, where we don't try to attain anything, we don't try to get anything. When we do so, he goes on to reveal how naturally there was happiness in deep sleep. So Bhagavan goes on to say, but only to free oneself from ignorance that makes us one believe is in unhappiness. So it is the ignorance that the ignorance is that I am a limited entity is the ignorance. And that makes us feel unhappy, says Bhagavan. The victim of this ignorance is the ego. It is when one destroys the ego that perfect happiness appears naturally. So what is the destruction of the ego? Enquiring who that ego is. And the ego rises in the form of an I. And only when we inquire, who am I? That is when we trace its source. What do I refer to as I? When I trace its source back, then I find out that in my natural true state, there is nothing being sought, that is nothing to be got anew, either for the sake of happiness, or if there is anything dissatisfaction in me that I need to get rid of. So this is all the game of the ego, all the game of the ignorance, where though everything is one single truth, it is being divided as many and limiting oneself to a small, let us say, to a body, like in the dream. Though all the dream creation and all the dream people and all the dream conversations, all created by me, again, I limit myself in the dream to be an individual, and I see the place separate, I see the people separate, and therefore I get fear, I get anxiety, I make all different kind of conversation, assuming that I am an individual separate in that whole dream. In a similar way, the ignorance, where though it is all but nothing but oneself, the pure being consciousness, to make though all the ornaments is nothing but gold, to forget the gold and to look only at the ornaments, and therefore the shape of the ornaments are different, and to believe that they are different from the gold brings the ignorance. So though everything is just the pure being consciousness, instead of seeing it as pure being consciousness, when we see them as names and forms and separateness, and that is seen by the ego, and when we give reality to that, forgetting the pure being consciousness to which all of them appear, forgetting that substratum, when we think these superimposed ideas are real, Bhagavan is saying that is when the unhappiness creeps in, and then the question comes, how do I obtain the happiness? So to kill that ignorance is the objective. So Bhagavan has given us self-enquiry, Atma Vichara, wherein every time the mind runs outward, ignorantly, looking for ideas and concepts and objects in the idea of finding happiness, he asks us to diligently inquire, to whom is this? Then the attention which was outward turned towards a thought or towards an object will be found to be for me. And then when we inquire, who am I? What do I refer to as I? And the true inquiry of who am I, without trying to answer it through another thought, but to really find out, what do I refer to as I? When we turn our attention to that, seek that, then the pure being consciousness will alone remain, which is our true nature, where there is nothing new to be got, nothing apart there, no divisions present there. It is one full substratum which alone is. And by repeatedly turning to that truth, Bhagavan assures that the mind will gain enough strength to remain and also recognize that all other things are just imaginary things and not going to be the source of happiness. And with that, the mind will gain enough strength to remain at the source, says Bhagavan. With abundant grace of Bhagavan, with which alone we have come to this most direct path, for the next 20 minutes, let us practice Atma Vichara. Bhagavate Sri Ramana Mormana or to Shardaka Mormanaka.
Namo Ramana. Prostrations to Ramana, shining as the self in all beings. By the immense grace of the self manifest as Ramana, we in this part of the satsang are meditating on verses of Ramana Gita. We are currently meditating on chapter 18 of Ramana Gita, and we are meditating on the third verse of chapter 18, which is entitled the Siddha Mahimanu Kirtanam, the praise, singing the praises of the Siddhas. All the 18 chapters of Ramana Gita are dialogues with Bhagavan Ramana, in a sense, questions and answers on various subjects. And in this chapter, specifically the 18th chapter, there is only one question and one answer by Bhagwan, which comes at the very, very end. And the prelude to it is literally Siddha Mahimanu Kirtanam. The question is about the glory of the Siddhas, and Bhagavan has answered about that glory. But as if to illustrate this glory, the entire chapter 18 of Ramana Gita, except for that one question and answer, is praises of Bhagavan Ramana by Ganapati Muni. And we are enjoying those praises. We are on the third verse, where Muni says, Akhila Samshaya Varana Bhashanam. Akhila Samshaya Varana Bhashanam. Brahmamadad Virajankusha Vikshanam. Aviratam Parasaukhyadratodhyamam. Nijatanu Vishayeshwala Salasam. Akhila Samshaya Varana Bhashanam. His words dispel all doubts. So, when we listen to Bhagavan's words, all our doubts must be dispelled. That is what Ganapati Muni is saying. That is indeed true listening to Bhagavan's words. In the very first chapter, the moment Bhagavan answers Muni's question, he says, I am grateful for this. I have another doubt. Because he is indicating that the moment Bhagavan has clarified about a particular doubt, there cannot be room for any confusion, any further vacillation in that particular area or that particular doubt. So Muni says, I am asking because another doubt is arising in my mind. But here he says, Akhila Samshaya Varana Bhashanam. So he says, Bhagavan's words dispel all doubts. Just now we were listening to Dileep Simhaji doing Mananam meditation on some of Bhagavan's words. So the words clearly indicate to us that happiness is not in objects. So if one has listened to Bhagavan's words with the totality of attention and the totality of faith, what happens after that? The moment Bhagavan says, there is no happiness in any object, then all our doubts in that direction should get cleared. They should get dropped. It also means that we should be ready to imbibe that truth, ready to let go of all our doubts by the faith that we have in Bhagavan's words. The words are very powerful. However, we need to have complete faith in those words if those words are to destroy the doubt, destroy our doubts, all our doubts. So when Bhagavan says happiness is not there in objects, can the mind rise again in search of objects to enjoy pleasures in objects? If the mind is rising in pursuit of happiness in objects, that means we do not have the requisite faith in Bhagavan's words. We may have partial faith, as Bhagavan says. He is so compassionate that he says we can even practice partial surrender. or partial faith, because surrender and faith are one and the same thing. So, if there is any pursuit of external pleasure, seeking of happiness in an object, it means that we still doubt the fact that the self is the entirety of us. That samshaya has to get dispelled. That doubt which we have, that the self is indeed the repository of all bliss, the source of all bliss. If we have that faith, there is no doubt in our mind, then the mind will not move away towards objects. However, if it does move towards objects, what are we to do? We have to go back to those words. Go back to those words and get support for our abidance once again from those words, because those words are very clear. They are very hard hitting, in fact, in places. So when we are dwelling on the words, we cannot have any doubt at that point of time. However, if we have let go of those doubt-dispelling words of Bhagavan, and we have decided to go on our own paths, in that case, doubts will come to us, because it is Bhagavan who dispels all the doubts. So doubts will come to us. Sometimes the doubts are relating to our own sadhana or relating to someone else's sadhana. All this, when the words are there, we can pay attention to the words as applied in the world, or we can pay attention to the words as applied in our own sadhana, or we can pay attention to the words to such a point that we drop the words also after we get their import. The moment Bhagavan says, turn back to the self, turn back to the source of I, and abide in that source. If the words come to us with their entire power, if our attention is so totally on those words, not as a concept, but as the truth, then they will dispel all our doubts by bestowing the experience of the self. And what happens if we do not have the strength? Then we turn to Bhagavan's beautiful look, glance. We seek that glance. In the Ramanacentre 12th, Ganapati Muni says, may your benevolent glance be turned once in my direction. O Ramana, may your gracious glance be turned once in my direction. So we turn to Bhagavan, we turn to his glance to give us the support to understand, to live by the powerful words of his Upadesha. And that glance gives us the necessary succor. But what indeed is this glance which Muni is talking about? He says it is a glance which destroys the mad elephant or the mind when it is totally uncontrollable like an elephant in rut. Such an elephant he brings under control. Brahmamadat viradam pushavikshanam, says Muni. So, the glance of Bhagavan, which Bhagavan says of Arunachala, Kannukku kannu. It is the eye of the eye. The true is actually shining within us. So if we are not able to be 100% with the words, instead of cogitating on the words, the moment we hear the words, if we can make it our own in totality, then there will be no further moving away. There will be no further doubts, says Simha. But if that is not the case, then one seeks a support, so that the next verse he says, Avirat Brahmamadat Viradam Pushabikshanam. That is his glance. And that glance is, Guru's glance is not only outside, it is within us. So when we turn within, that light which shows us the path of self-inquiry within is the light, is the glance of the Sadguru. That is the internal glance of the Sadguru. So that gives us the support, that vigilance, that awareness. So what is it that makes me doubt? What is it that makes me hold on to thought? So get back to the vigilance of self-inquiry with that awareness, with that alertness. That vigilance itself is Bhagavan's glance of grace. Aviratam parasaukhya dhritotyamam. So Muni says all of Bhagavan's activities were for the good of the world, because in the last line he says, Nijatanu Vishayeshwala Salasam. He is completely indifferent to his own bodily needs. So Bhagavan's stature, which is being described by the Muni, is a sadhana patha for us. For him, it is that state. For us, it is a sadhana patha, not to pay attention to our own bodily image, but to allow the body to engage in activities as allowed by the divine destiny, not for fulfilling our own desires, but let it do its job as assigned to it in Bhagavan's plan. Then what happens is that our activities, because they are not motivated by desire or ego or attachment to the body, those activities will become pure activities which are guided by the divine force, and they will necessarily be for the good of all. We can either consciously try to engage in activities which are good for everyone, but the best is not to consciously try to do this or that, says Bhagavan. Even to Humphreys, Bhagavan says, it should be unconscious power. Whatever is happening through you, you should not be paying attention to A is happening through me or B is happening through me. On the other hand, it will be unconscious power. It will happen automatically. You keep your attention on that which is the source of all, that which is the Sakshi of all, that which is totally untouched by any of the movements of the world, says Bhagavan. So Bhagavan has given us all his works, all the words, because each and every word of Bhagavan has the power to turn the mind within. And his extraordinary grace allows us also to dwell on those words again and again, so that it becomes at one point of time an absolute reality for us. When the words will fall off, says Bhagavan, the words will fall off like a snake dropping its skin, and the essence will remain. The experience will remain. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ram.
Namo Rabna. अपार सच्चित् सुखवारिदाशे यस्योर्मिमात्रं भुवनं समस्तम् गुहाहितं तं रमणं गभीरम् चिन्ताविहीनं हृदि चिन्तयामि चिन्ताविहीनं हृदि चिन्तयामि नमो रमनाथ।